Hi there tonight. We are going to drift back through time, not just by decades, but by nearly a millennium. You're standing in a world lit only by fire and moon, a world where the water isn't safe to drink, and the air hangs thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and manure. It's a place of breathtaking beauty and brutal everyday hardship. The concepts of germ theory, human rights, and reliable Wi-Fi are centuries away. Frankly, if you were dropped here for real, your chances of surviving the first week are questionable. But from the safety of your bed, you can experience the whole sweep of it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air in the stone room is frigid, clinging to you like a damp shroud. It's January 1066, and England holds its breath. You're standing in the background, a face in the tapestry of the royal court at Westminster, watching King Edward the Confessor fade away. He has been a pious, and for the most part, peaceful king. But he has made one catastrophic error. He has failed to produce a clear heir. Medieval succession planning makes a modern corporate restructuring look like a model of clarity, and Edward has left behind a hornet's nest of promises, half-promises, and assumptions. As the king's life ebbs, three powerful men imagine the English crown resting on their own head. The first and the most obvious choice is right here in the room with you. Harold Godwinson. He is the Earl of Wessex, the richest and most powerful man in England, the king's right hand. He's English, he's respected, and he's a proven military leader. He claims Edward on his deathbed pointed to him and named him protector of the realm. It's a solid claim, at least within these cold stone walls. But across the churning gray channel, another man fumes, Duke William of Normandy. He is tough, illegitimate by birth, and has spent his entire life fighting to hold on to his own lands. He claims that years ago, Edward, who spent much of his youth in exile in Normandy, promised the throne to him. He even claims that Harold Godwinson himself once swore an oath on holy relics to support William's claim. Whether Harold was under duress or just being politically savvy at the time is a matter of endless debate, but to William, it's a sacred binding contract. He is not a man who takes betrayal lightly. And then far to the north across the wind-whipped sea is the third contender, Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway. His name literally means hard ruler, and he's a living legend, a giant of a man who fought his way from exile to the Norwegian throne. His claim is more tenuous, based on an old forgotten pact between previous kings. But he has a fleet of longships, thousands of Viking warriors eager for plunder, and an insatiable appetite for glory. For him, England is the final gleaming prize of a lifetime of war. The old king dies. The very next day, Harold Godwinson is crowned King of England. It's a rush job meant to solidify his power before anyone can object. You watch him place the crown on his head, and you can almost feel the weight of the troubles to come. You spend the spring and summer on the southern coast of England, staring out at the sea. The militias are gathered, the ships are ready. Everyone knows William is coming. The wind, however, seems to be on England's side. For weeks, it blows from the north, pinning the Norman invasion fleet in its French harbor. The days turn into weeks. The soldiers grow restless, their supplies dwindle. Eventually, Harold has to disband the militia. The men have harvests to bring in. It seems the danger has passed, but the wind is a fickle ally. Just as the south coast stands down, the wind shifts. It now blows fair for an invasion from the north. In late September, news arrives carried by a rider who has nearly killed his horse to get to you. Harold Hardrada has landed. He has sailed up the Humber, crushed a northern army, and taken the city of York. You are with King Harold as he receives the news. There is no choice. You gather your professional soldiers, the elite housecarls, and begin a forced march. You cover nearly 200 miles in 5 days. Your feet are blistered, your muscles burn, and you sleep for only moments at a time. It's a commute that makes a modern-day traffic jam seem like a pleasant diversion. You arrive at Stamford Bridge on September 25th. The Norwegian army is completely unprepared, enjoying the autumn sun, many of them not even wearing their mail shirts. The attack is a total surprise and a brutal success. The battle rages all day, a desperate hacking affair. In a truly quirky and legendary tidbit of history, a single gigantic Viking berserker reportedly held the narrow bridge against your entire army, felling challenger after challenger until someone floated under the bridge in a barrel and thrust a spear up through the planks. The Norwegian army is annihilated. Both Harold Hardrada and Harold Godwinson's own estranged brother Tostig, who had joined the Vikings, lie dead. It is a stunning absolute victory. As you stand amidst the carnage, catching your breath, another messenger arrives, his face pale with panic. The wind, the very same wind that brought the Vikings, finally changed. 3 days after your victory here in the north, William's fleet landed unopposed at Pevensey on the south coast. The Normans are ashore, burning villages and consolidating their position. The bitter irony is almost too much to bear. Your victorious army is battered, exhausted, and now has to turn around and march 250 miles south to face a fresh, rested, and heavily armored foe. On the morning of October 14th, 1066, you stand on a ridge called Senlac Hill. Below you, the Norman army assembles. It's a battle of styles. Your English army is almost entirely infantry, forming a dense, impenetrable shield wall, bristling with spears and axes. The Normans are a combined arms force of archers, foot soldiers, and most importantly, armored knights on powerful war horses. The Norman trumpets sound and the battle begins. For hours, the shield wall holds. Norman arrows rain down, thudding into wooden shields. Their infantry charges and breaks against your wall of spears. Their knights thunder up the slope only to be repulsed time and again. The Normans try a clever, risky tactic, the feigned retreat. Knights charge, then pretend to flee, trying to lure your men to break formation and chase them. A few times it works, and small groups are cut off and slaughtered. But still, the wall largely holds. As evening approaches, the battle hangs in the balance. And then, disaster. King Harold is struck down. Historians still argue whether Harold was felled by a single arrow to the eye, as the Bayeux Tapestry seems to suggest, or if he was cut down by a squad of Norman knights in the final desperate moments of the fight. Whatever the cause with the king, dead panic rips through the English ranks. The shield wall, the heart of your defense, finally shatters. The fight becomes a rout. You see the golden dragon banner of Wessex fall, and the papal banner of Duke William rise in its place. The day and the kingdom is lost. William, now forever known as the Conqueror, will march to London and be crowned King of the English on Christmas Day, beginning a new and brutal chapter in the island's story. The shield wall is broken, Your king is dead, and a cold dread settles over the land. You follow the scent of fear and pragmatism to Berkhamsted, where you watch as the surviving English earls and even the Archbishop of Canterbury bend the knee to the Norman Duke. There is no one left to lead a fight. Submission is the only path to survival. William accepts their oaths, and you trail in his wake to London, a city simmering with resentment. On Christmas Day, you press into the back of the newly built Westminster Abbey, the final great project of the old King Edward. The air is thick with incense and tension. William, tall and imposing, stands before the altar. The ceremony is a mixture of Old English rites and new Norman proclamations, a clumsy attempt to stitch two worlds together. When the Archbishop asks the assembled nobles if they accept William as their king, they shout their acclamation in Anglo-Saxon. The roar echoes through the stone church. But outside, the Norman guards, jumpy and unfamiliar with the language, hear only a hostile mob. They panic. This is the quirky, disastrous tidbit of the day. The coronation of the first Norman king of England was immediately marred when his own guards, mistaking cheers for a riot, set fire to the houses surrounding the abbey. Smoke begins to fill the church, and the congregation scrambles for the exits, choking and terrified. William is left trembling with rage before the altar, with only a few priests to hastily finish the ceremony. It's a public relations disaster of epic proportions and a perfect omen for the reign to come. The union is not a happy one. It is one born of fire and fear. For the first couple of years, it seems like a fragile peace might hold. William confiscates the lands of all the men who fought against him at Hastings and gives them to his loyal Norman and French followers, but he leaves the remaining English lords in place. He wants to be seen as the legitimate successor, not just a conqueror. But the English are a proud people, and a foreign king, with his foreign soldiers speaking their guttural French, is a constant offense. Soon, the rebellions begin. Whispers in alehouses turn into armed uprisings. You see the pattern emerge. A revolt flares up, and the Norman response is swift, professional, and utterly ruthless. And with every crushed rebellion, a new scar appears on the landscape, a castle. They are built with frantic speed, not the grand stone fortresses you might imagine, but efficient instruments of occupation called motte and baileys. A huge mound of earth, the motte is piled up, topped with a wooden tower. Below it is a courtyard, the bailey, enclosed by a wooden palisade and a ditch. They pop up all over the country, often built right on top of Anglo-Saxon settlements, a constant looming reminder of who is in charge now. They are garrisons, watchtowers, and symbols of terror dominating the surrounding countryside. From their walls, Norman lords look down upon their new unwilling subjects. The resistance, however, is not yet broken. In 1069, the north of England erupts in the greatest challenge William will ever face. They slaughter the Norman garrison at Durham and welcome a huge fleet of Danish ships sent by the Danish king, who still has his own eye on the English throne. The rebels seize York. This is not just a riot, it's a full-scale war for liberation. William's response is not just military, it is genocidal. He marches north, retakes York, and then unleashes a campaign of methodical, calculated devastation that will be remembered for centuries as the harrying of the North. You are not a soldier in this. You are a villager cowering in your hut as the Norman columns march through your valley. They are not here to fight an army. They are here to destroy a society. You watch as they put every building to the torch. They slaughter livestock and leave the carcasses to rot in the fields. They burn the seed grain ensuring there will be no harvest next year. They salt the earth. The sky turns a permanent hazy gray from the smoke of burning settlements. It is a scorched earth policy, so complete, so inhuman, that even by the brutal standards of the 11th century, it was considered shocking. The chronicles written years later speak of a land utterly depopulated, where the survivors were forced to resort to cannibalism, eating not only their own dead, but also selling their children into slavery for a scrap of food. William has not just defeated the North, he has erased it. The message is clear. Resistance is futile and will be met with annihilation. With the rebellions finally and irrevocably crushed, the true Normanization of England begins. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy is systematically dismantled. By the time William dies, less than 5% of the land in England is held by native Englishmen. The rest is in the hands of some 200 Norman barons and the church. With this new ruling class comes a new language. You find that the lord in the castle, the bishop in his cathedral, the judge in the court, they all speak French. Latin is the language of written documents, but French is the language of power. Your own English tongue becomes the language of the conquered, the common folk. It will be centuries before it reemerges as the language of government. Then, 20 years after the conquest, in the winter of 1085, the king holds his court and makes a momentous decision. He wants a full accounting of his kingdom. He wants to know exactly what he owns, who holds what land from him, and how much it is all worth. This is the genesis of the Domesday Book. You are in your village trying to rebuild a life when the king's commissioners arrive. They are not friendly census takers. They are stern-faced officials flanked by soldiers with a list of terrifyingly specific questions. How many plows in the village? How many mills? How many beehives? How much pasture? How much woodland? What was it worth in the time of King Edward? And what is it worth now? They question the priest, the reeve, and a jury of local men under oath. It is the most thorough, invasive tax audit imaginable, conducted with the full authority of an absolute monarch. The English people, with their typical gallows humor, nickname the Great Survey the Domesday Book, as in Doomsday, because its judgment was as final and inescapable as God's on the last day. Historians still argue whether the Domesday Book was primarily a fiscal tool for maximizing tax revenue or a broader statement of royal authority, a legal document solidifying the land grants to his new Norman elite. But for you standing there and accounting for your single pig, the message is the same every inch of this land. Every animal, every person now belongs to the conqueror. The forging of the kingdom in fire is complete. The conqueror, the man who had seemed more force of nature than mortal, dies not on a battlefield, but from an internal injury after his horse stumbled in the burning ruins of a French town. His end is as chaotic and brutal as his beginning. His sons and barons abandon his body, racing off to secure their own lands and fortunes. You are left to witness the rather quirky and ignominious final scene. At his funeral in Caen, you watch as the bishops try to shoehorn his bloated corpse into a stone sarcophagus that is far too small. They push, and the royal body, strained by the pressure and the summer heat, bursts open. A truly foul stench fills the cathedral, sending even the most devout mourners gagging into the fresh air. It's a messy end for a man who demanded absolute order. His will splits his vast domains, setting up the ultimate family feud, where instead of arguing over a vintage armchair, his sons are fighting over entire countries. The eldest, Robert Curthose, a well-liked but famously indolent warrior, gets the ancestral Duchy of Normandy. The third son, the sharp and literate Henry, gets a pile of silver and is told to bide his time. And the middle son, his father's favorite, gets the real prize, England. His name is William, but everyone knows him by his nickname Rufus, for his ruddy complexion and fiery red hair. You now live in the court of William II. The atmosphere changes overnight. The grim, calculating authority of the conqueror is replaced by a loud, swaggering energy. Rufus is a soldier through and through. He has no time for priests' books or laws except for how they can serve his immediate needs. His court is less of a royal court and more of a rowdy, kingdom-wide locker room filled with rough mercenaries and ambitious young knights. He is generous to his friends and utterly ruthless to his enemies. He is constantly at war, either with his brother Robert over in Normandy, with the Welsh princes, or with the Scottish king. His most famous feud, however, is with the church, specifically the saintly but stubborn Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm. Rufus sees the church not as a spiritual institution, but as a source of revenue. When a bishop or abbot dies, he simply refuses to appoint a successor, sometimes for years, allowing the crown to collect all the rich incomes from the vacant lands. Anselm is horrified by this, and the two men clash constantly. Rufus, with his characteristic sarcasm, holds his bishops in contempt, bleeding them dry to fund his armies. It's a policy of blatant extortion that makes him powerful, but earns him the undying hatred of the clerical chroniclers who would write his history. And then on a hot August day in the year 1100, you find yourself in the New Forest, the royal hunting ground his father had created. The king is in high spirits preparing for the hunt. An arrow maker comes to present him with 6 new arrows, and Rufus, ever the showman, gives 2 to a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell, saying, "The best arrows for the best shot." The party rides into the woods. The details of what happens next are lost to the misty, dappled light of the forest. There's a stag, a shot, a shout. You see panicked men riding out of the glade. The king is dead, a single arrow protruding from his chest. Walter Tyrrell, the man who supposedly fired the fatal shot, doesn't wait around to explain. He leaps on his horse and flees the country immediately. The other nobles, in a shocking display of self-interest, simply abandon the king's body where it fell. But one man acts with lightning speed, the king's younger brother, Henry. He wasn't even supposed to be there. He gallops not to his brother's body, but straight to the royal treasury. At Winchester, seizes it, and then rides hard for London. Within 3 days, he is crowned king. Historians still argue whether William Rufus's death was a genuine accident in a dangerous sport, or a cleverly orchestrated assassination with his brother Henry being the most likely and most successful beneficiary. As you watch a local charcoal burner load Rufus's bleeding corpse onto a humble cart for its final journey, you can't help but suspect the latter. King Henry I is a completely different man. Where Rufus was a hot-tempered warrior, Henry is cool, calculating and patient. His nickname is Beauclerc, the fine scholar, because unusually, for a monarch of his time, he can read and write. He knows his claim to the throne is shaky, so his first acts are brilliant political maneuvers. He issues a document known as the Charter of Liberties, a key historical fact, in which he publicly promises to end the abuses of his brother's reign. He vows to respect the church, to limit royal taxes, and to uphold just laws. It's a direct appeal to the barons and clergy whose support he desperately needs. Then, in an even smarter move, he marries Edith, a princess from the old Anglo-Saxon royal line of Wessex. She changes her name to the more Norman-sounding Matilda, but for the English people, it's a powerful symbol. It's a way of saying the old wounds are healing, that the Norman and Saxon bloodlines are finally uniting. It's a clever piece of political theater, and it works. Henry brings a new kind of order to England. He is obsessed with efficiency and justice, his kind of justice at least. He creates a system of traveling judges to enforce royal law throughout the kingdom. He strengthens the government's financial machinery, making sure every penny owed to the crown is collected. He is harsh, yes, but he is also predictable, and after the chaotic reign of Rufus, the barons and the common folk alike appreciate the stability. He eventually defeats his hapless older brother Robert in battle, captures him, and unites England and Normandy once more, keeping his brother imprisoned for the rest of his long life. Henry has everything he wants. He has 2 legitimate children, a daughter, Matilda, and a son, William Adelin, his pride and joy, the undisputed heir to the throne. The dynasty seems secure. And then, one cold night in November 1120, it all turns to dust and sea foam. The royal court is in Normandy, preparing to sail back to England. You watch as the 17-year-old heir, William Adelin, and a boisterous group of his young friends persuade the king to let them travel on a different ship. It's the fastest, newest vessel in the fleet, a marvel of technology called the White Ship. As King Henry's ship sails ahead, the young nobles on the White Ship begin to party. They break out the wine casks, and soon everyone from the prince to the sailors is roaring drunk. They set off late in the dark, trying to catch the king's ship. But the helmsman, his senses dulled by wine, steers the ship straight onto a submerged rock just outside the harbor. The sound of splintering wood is followed by screams that carry across the cold water. The ship goes down in minutes. Only one man, a butcher from Rouen, survives by clinging to the wreckage. The heir to the English throne, his half-siblings, and the flower of the Anglo-Norman nobility are all gone, drowned in the icy black water. They say that after that day, King Henry I, the great and powerful scholar king, was never seen to smile again. All his careful plans, all his victories had been undone by a drunken party and a single hidden rock. The future was no longer secure. It was a terrifying blank. The great King Henry never smiles again, but his mind is as sharp as ever. His only legitimate heir is now his daughter Matilda. She is a formidable woman, recently returned to him after the death of her husband, the Holy Roman Emperor, a title that she proudly uses for the rest of her life. A woman has never ruled England, but Henry is determined to bend history to his will. 3 times he summons the great barons of the realm, making them place their hands on holy relics and swear a solemn oath to accept his daughter as their queen upon his death. You are there in the hall, one of the powerful lords, and as you murmur the words of the oath, you can feel the reluctance around you. Swearing fealty to a distant king is one thing. Swearing it to his haughty, formidable daughter is another. It feels a bit like agreeing to the terms and conditions on a website. You say yes, but you're not entirely sure what you've just signed up for. In 1135, Henry I dies of a fever after eating a few too many of his favorite fish lampreys against his doctor's orders. The moment the news of his death crosses the channel, those solemn oaths dissolve like mist. While Empress Matilda is far away in Anjou, with her new and much disliked husband, Geoffrey Plantagenet, another claimant makes his move. This is Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew. He is everything. Matilda is not handsome, charming, easygoing, and popular. He doesn't wait for an invitation. He races across the channel, gets the backing of the powerful Bishop of Winchester. His own brother seizes the royal treasury and has himself hastily crowned in London. The barons, including many who had sworn to support Matilda, flocked to his side. A known agreeable man seemed a much safer bet than an unknown difficult woman. Matilda, however, is her father's daughter, and she is not one to let a mere usurpation stand in her way. It takes her a few years, but in 1139, she lands on the south coast with a small force ready to claim her inheritance. The kingdom splits. Barons declare for Stephen or for Matilda, often based on little more than local rivalries and who they think is more likely to win. And so begins the period known to history as the Anarchy. The name is not an exaggeration. For nearly 2 decades, England is consumed by a civil war that is less about grand battles and more about bitter, grinding sieges and brutal local score settling. The central authority you had come to rely on under Henry I completely evaporates. Local lords build castles without royal permission, so-called adulteran, or unlicensed castles. And from these new strongholds, they terrorize the surrounding countryside. You, as a common person, are now trapped. Your village might declare for Stephen, while the lord in his new castle, a mile away, has declared for Matilda, and you are caught in the crossfire. Armed gangs roam the land, plundering and burning. A famous account from the Peterborough Chronicle of the time captures the despair perfectly. It says that the great lords sorely burdened the unhappy people. They filled the castles with devils and wicked men. Men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. This wasn't just war. It was the collapse of society itself. Historians still argue about the true extent of the anarchy. While some regions suffered immensely, others may have experienced relative stability under powerful magnates who simply ignored the distant civil war. But for many, it was a waking nightmare. The fortunes of war swing back and forth. In early 1141, at the Battle of Lincoln, Stephen's army is defeated, and the king himself is captured after fighting bravely on foot until his sword breaks. You watch as he is led away in chains. Surely this is the end. Matilda has won. She makes her way to London in triumph to arrange her coronation. But victory brings out the worst in her. She acts not as a conciliator, but as a conqueror, dismissing the pleas of Stephen's wife, refusing to negotiate with the Londoners, and demanding huge sums of money. She possessed all the diplomatic grace of a kicked badger. The citizens of London, who were prepared to accept her, are so enraged by her arrogance that they rise up and chase her out of the city just days before she was to be crowned. She flees to Oxford, her victory turned to ashes. Soon after, her greatest asset, her brilliant half-brother and General Robert of Gloucester, is captured by Stephen's forces. In a move that feels like a modern superstar sports trade, Matilda is forced to exchange her prize captive King Stephen to get her brother back. The war is back on. The following winter provides one of the most quirky and cinematic moments of the era. Matilda finds herself besieged and trapped in Oxford Castle, surrounded by Stephen's army. With food running out and surrender seeming inevitable, she orchestrates a daring escape. On a bitter snowy night, she and 3 loyal knights dress entirely in white cloaks. They are lowered from the castle walls and camouflaged against the winter landscape. They slip quietly past the enemy sentries, cross the frozen surface of the River Thames, and walk miles through the snow to safety. It's a moment of incredible bravery and cunning in a war defined mostly by suffering. The conflict grinds on for years, a miserable stalemate. Castles are won and lost, but neither side can land a decisive blow. England grows weary. The barons are tired of the expense. The people are tired of the chaos. The end, when it comes, is driven not by the exhausted combatants, but by the next generation. Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, is now a young man. He has inherited his mother's tenacity, his father's lands in France, and his grandfather's genius for rule. He lands in England in 1153 with a fresh army. But by a strange twist of fate, just as a new round of fighting is about to begin, Stephen's own son and heir Eustace dies suddenly of a fever. Stephen, now aging and broken by grief, loses his will to fight. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief across the kingdom. At Wallingford, by the banks of the Thames, the two sides meet not to fight, but to talk. A treaty is agreed upon. Stephen will remain king for the short remainder of his life, but he will officially adopt young Henry Plantagenet as his son and heir. The war is over. Less than a year later, Stephen dies peacefully. The shipwreck of the kingdom is finally over, and you watch as a new formidable figure steps ashore to claim his prize, Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet kings, a man who will forge an empire even greater than the conquerors. The anarchy ends not with a bang, but with a weary sigh of relief. And into this exhausted kingdom steps a whirlwind of pure energy. In 1154, Henry Plantagenet, son of the Empress Matilda, arrives to claim his throne. He is just 21 years old, powerfully built, with restless gray eyes and a shock of red hair. You can feel the change in the air almost immediately. There is a new master, and he does not tolerate chaos. His first order of business is to travel the length of England with a massive army, systematically demolishing the hundreds of unlicensed adulterine castles that had scarred the landscape during Stephen's reign. The message is clear and brutally effective. The time of petty tyrants is over. Royal authority is back, and what authority it is. You are now the subject of something far grander than the Kingdom of England. Through his father, Henry is the Count of Anjou. Through his mother, he is the Duke of Normandy. And through his brilliant marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the formidable and recently divorced Queen of France, he is also Duke of Aquitaine and Gascony. His territory, which historians will later call the Angevin Empire, stretches from the misty border with Scotland all the way down to the Pyrenees Mountains in the south of France. Managing this sprawling multilingual empire with its patchwork of different laws and customs made a modern CEO's portfolio look like a lemonade stand. Henry is constantly on the move, a blur of motion, holding court in Winchester 1 month and settling a dispute in Bordeaux the next. Though he spends much of his time in France, his impact on England is perhaps his most enduring legacy. Henry has a genius for governance and a passion for law. He finds the English legal system a messy tangle of local customs, feudal obligations, and superstitious practices like trial by combat or trial by ordeal, where you prove your innocence by, say, grabbing a red-hot iron bar and not having your hand fester. Henry seeks to replace all this with a single rational system of royal justice available to all free men. This is the law part of his reign. You see him expand his grandfather's system of traveling judges, sending them out to all corners of the kingdom. He popularizes the use of rich, simple documents a person could buy to have their case heard in a royal court. Most importantly, he champions the use of a jury not yet to decide guilt, but to investigate the facts of a case. This is all formalized in a landmark piece of legislation, the Assize of Clarendon in 1166. It is a mainstream historical fact that this series of acts laid the very foundation of English common law, a system that would be exported across the globe. For you, a man trying to protect your small plot of land, this is revolutionary. You no longer have to challenge your powerful neighbor to a duel you would surely lose. Now, you can rely on the king's law. In the process, Henry basically invented the concept of suing someone, which is arguably one of England's most enduring cultural exports, and he massively increased the power and wealth of the crown. There is, however, one great institution that stands outside his legal revolution, the church. The clergy have their own courts, governed by canon law. If a priest commits a crime, even murder, he can claim benefit of clergy and be tried in a church court where the punishments are scandalously light, often just a penance or a fine. This infuriates the orderly mind of the king. To fix this, he needs a loyal, ruthless man in the top job in the English church, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he has the perfect candidate, his best friend Thomas Becket. You have seen them together for years. Becket, the brilliant and flamboyant chancellor, is the king's shadow, his enforcer, his drinking companion. They are two sides of the same coin. Becket helps Henry manage the kingdom, raises his taxes, and seems to share his every thought. So in 1162, when the old archbishop dies, Henry makes what seems like a masterstroke. He makes his loyal friend the new archbishop. It was the ultimate case of promoting your buddy to a key position, and it backfires more spectacularly than any office party in history. The moment the holy vestments touch his shoulders, Thomas Becket undergoes a staggering transformation. He resigns as chancellor. He gives away his wealth, eats simple food, and secretly begins to wear a coarse hair shirt against his skin as a sign of penance. The king's worldly courtier has become a zealous ascetic, a fierce defender of the church's liberties against the very king he once served. The friendship sours into a bitter public feud that escalates into the rage of Henry's reign. The king demands the clergy submit to his laws. Becket refuses. The king pushes back harder. The conflict becomes so toxic that Becket is forced to flee England and live in exile in France for 6 years. Finally, a fragile truce is negotiated and Becket returns. But the peace lasts only a few weeks. Becket immediately excommunicates the bishops who had supported Henry in his absence. When news of this fresh defiance reaches the king at his court in Normandy, he explodes in one of the incandescent rages for which he was famous. Pacing the floor, he is said to have shouted something to the effect of, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and promoted in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk?" Historians still argue about the exact wording and whether his famous cry of "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest" was a calculated deniable order, or the genuine unthinking shriek of a man pushed beyond his limits. 4 of his household knights, hearing his words, took them as a command. They slip away from court, take a ship across the channel, and ride to Canterbury. On the evening of December 29th, 1170, they stride into Canterbury Cathedral, their swords drawn. They find Becket refusing to flee, standing proudly before the main altar. They try to drag him out, but he resists. In the ensuing struggle in the holy sanctuary of his own cathedral, they cut him down. The archbishop is murdered. The news is a shockwave that reverberates across all of Europe. As the monks later tend to his body, they make a quirky discovery that sealed his legacy. Beneath his fine robes, they find the coarse, filthy hair shirt crawling with lice. The worldly chancellor had truly become a holy martyr. Henry's greatest friend was now his most famous victim, and the king would have to perform a dramatic public penance to save his throne and his soul. The murder of Thomas Becket leaves a deep infected wound on Henry II's reign. To atone, you watch the most powerful man in Europe walk barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and allow himself to be scourged by the monks at Becket's tomb. It is a moment of profound humiliation, but his troubles are far from over. His greatest enemies are now those of his own household. His 4 surviving sons, Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, are ambitious, resentful, and egged on by their equally formidable mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. The Plantagenet family gatherings must have been incredibly tense, likely requiring a professional mediator and several food tasters. In what becomes known as the Great Revolt, his sons and wife rise up against him in a massive, coordinated rebellion. Henry, still a brilliant general, crushes them and even imprisons his own Queen Eleanor for the next 15 years. The family is broken a devil's brood, bound by mutual suspicion. After the heir dies from disease, the next in line is Richard, his mother's favorite. Richard is a warrior poet, a military prodigy, handsome, charismatic, and obsessed with the ideals of chivalry. He is everything a medieval hero is supposed to be. He has, however, almost zero interest in England itself. When old King Henry finally dies, worn down and broken-hearted after discovering that even his youngest favorite son John has betrayed him, Richard I ascends the throne. His first actions as king reveal his priorities perfectly. He is going on crusade, and he needs money. His approach to royal finance was basically a kingdom-wide garage sale, where everything, including the garage, was for sale. He sells off castles, titles, and high offices to the highest bidder. He famously quips that he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. Within months, he has amassed a vast fortune, appointed a council to run the country in his absence, and sailed away, leaving England behind. You travel with him, a face in the vast army of the Third Crusade. The goal is to recapture Jerusalem from the hands of the legendary Muslim Sultan Saladin. The journey is an epic in itself. Richard's fleet conquers the island of Sicily, and then the island of Cyprus, which he uses as a supply base. Finally, you arrive in the Holy Land. The heat is oppressive, the dust is everywhere, and the fighting is savage. You witness Richard's military genius firsthand at the long, brutal siege of the city of Acre. After its fall, he cements his reputation for both brilliance and brutality by ordering the massacre of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners. Later, you march with the army down the coast toward Jaffa. For days, you are harried by Saladin's light cavalry, a constant stinging nuisance. Richard enforces iron discipline, forbidding his knights from breaking ranks to give chase. Then, at the perfect moment, at the Battle of Arsuf, with Saladin's forces committed and bunched together, Richard unleashes a devastating coordinated charge of his heavily armored knights. It is a tactical masterpiece, a stunning victory that shatters the myth of Saladin's invincibility and secures the coastline. This is how he earns his famous nickname, Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart. But while Richard is earning his immortal nickname, his kingdom back home is in trouble. And the name of that trouble is his younger brother, Prince John. While the Lionheart is away, the weasel, is at play. You see John for what he is: clever, administratively gifted, but also treacherous, cruel, and consumed by jealousy of his older brother. He tries to seize control, making alliances with Richard's great rival King Philip of France, and spreading rumors that Richard has been killed on crusade. John's attempt to take over was the medieval equivalent of trying to change the family Netflix password while the account owner is on vacation. It's audacious, but ultimately doomed if the owner returns unexpectedly. His efforts are mostly thwarted by the council Richard left in charge, and by the sheer force of will of his mother, the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was released from her long imprisonment to keep the peace. The crusade, for all its military glory, ultimately fails to capture Jerusalem. A treaty is made, and Richard, his health failing, begins the long journey home. This is where disaster strikes. He is shipwrecked in the Adriatic, and while trying to travel overland in disguise, he is recognized and captured by the Duke of Austria, an enemy he had made at the siege of Acre. The Duke hands him over to the Holy Roman Emperor, who sees a golden opportunity. He holds the most famous king in Christendom for ransom, demanding the colossal sum of 150,000 marks, several times the annual income of the English crown. This is the origin of the quirky romantic legend of the minstrel Blondel, who supposedly wandered from castle to castle in Germany, singing a song that only he and Richard knew, until he heard the king's voice answer from a prison window. The reality was less musical. His location was discovered through diplomacy. But back in England, a massive tax is levied, a full quarter of the value of all movable goods, and the land is demanded from every subject to free the king. While his mother Eleanor masterminds the collection, his brother John is actively negotiating with the emperor, offering him money to keep Richard locked up for longer. But the ransom is paid. When Richard finally lands back in England, after years away, John's pathetic rebellion melts away. Richard, in a moment of surprising clemency, summons his treacherous brother and pardons him, supposedly saying with a sigh, "He is only a child who has had evil counselors." Historians still argue about Richard the Fern's legacy. Was he the epitome of chivalric kingship, or a negligent ruler who bled his kingdom dry for personal glory? For most English people at the time, the answer was clear. They had their heroic, if expensive, king back. Richard would spend only a few months in England before returning to France to fight his rival King Philip, where a few years later, while besieging a minor castle, he would be shot by a boy with a crossbow, leaving the throne to the very brother who had so eagerly betrayed him. The Lionheart is dead killed by a crossbow bolt at a minor siege in France. And now, his brother John is King of England. If you thought his treachery as a prince was bad, you soon learn that his character as a king is even worse. John possessed the personal charm of a final demand letter. His claim to the throne is immediately challenged by his nephew, the young Arthur of Brittany, who is supported by the King of France. But in a rare flash of military competence, John surprises his enemies, capturing Arthur and the leading rebels. The boy is imprisoned, and then he simply vanishes. No one ever sees him again. While there is no definitive proof, everyone knows the grim truth: the king has murdered his own nephew. It's a ruthless start to a reign that will descend into disaster. You had seen the Angevin Empire of Henry II, that vast collection of lands stretching across France. Under Richard, it was defended. Under John, you watch it crumble. King Philip of France, using Arthur's murder as his legal justification, declares John's French lands forfeit and invades Normandy. The English and Norman barons, who own estates on both sides of the Channel, look to their king to lead them. John fails spectacularly. He is indecisive, suspicious of his own commanders, and prone to panicked retreats. The barons give him a new humiliating nickname, Soft Sword. One by one, the great fortresses of his ancestors fall. In 1204, the capital of Normandy itself, Rouen, surrenders. The ancestral homeland, the duchy from which the conqueror himself had launched his invasion, is lost. All that remains of Henry II's mighty empire is a sliver of Gascony in the distant south. The fury of the English barons, who have just lost their valuable continental estates, is a simmering fire that will soon burn John badly. Having lost an empire, John promptly stumbles into a fight he cannot win, this time with the church. He gets into a bitter dispute with the formidable Pope Innocent III over who should be the next Archbishop of Canterbury. When John refuses to accept the Pope's candidate, the Pope places the entire Kingdom of England under an interdict. You feel this directly. It was a spiritual service not available in your region message, and it terrified everyone. The church bells fall silent. The doors are locked. There are no masses, no weddings, no Christian burials. It is a state of spiritual lockdown designed to turn the people against their king. John retaliates by seizing church lands and revenues. The Pope excommunicates him personally. The crisis drags on for years until, facing the threat of a French invasion sanctioned by the Pope, John doesn't just give in. He capitulates in the most groveling way imaginable. He accepts the Pope's archbishop, and then in a stunning move, he declares that the entire Kingdom of England is a papal fiefdom. You are now officially living in a vassal state of the papacy. To fund his desperate last-ditch attempt to reclaim his lost French lands, John taxes his barons with a ferocity that makes his predecessors look gentle. He squeezes them for every last penny. And in 1214, when his grand European alliance is smashed by the French at the Battle of Bouvines, the barons decide they have had enough. They renounce their oaths of fealty, form an army, and march against the king. They call themselves the Army of God. Finding himself cornered and with London in the rebels' hands, John is forced to negotiate. In the middle of June 1215, you witness a tense gathering in a water meadow by the River Thames, a place called Runnymede. Here, the king is presented with a document, a list of demands from his rebellious subjects. He is forced to affix his great seal to this Charter of Liberties, the Magna Carta. This is a pivotal moment in history. It was not a document about democracy or rights for the common person, but a feudal contract. Its core principle, however, was revolutionary. It stated that the barons had rights that the king was legally bound to respect. It meant that even the king was not above the law. John agreed to it with all the enthusiasm of someone signing a massive, unexpected bill. He never had any intention of honoring it. Complaining that he had been forced to sign it under duress, he got his new friend, the Pope, to declare Magna Carta null and void just a few weeks later. This betrayal plunges the country into open civil war, known as the First Barons' War. The rebel barons, in a move of pure desperation, offer the crown of England to Prince Louis, the heir to the French throne, who promptly invades and captures the southern half of the country. The kingdom is once again being torn apart. During this chaotic warfare, you hear of a final emblematic disaster. In October 1216, while campaigning in East Anglia, John attempts to take a shortcut across the treacherous tidal estuary known as the Wash. He makes it across safely, but the slow-moving baggage train behind him carrying his royal treasury. And according to legend, the crown jewels themselves is caught by the swift-moving, unpredictable tide. The wagons, the gold, the priceless symbols of English monarchy, all are consumed by the silty water and quicksand lost forever. Historians still argue about the true fate of the treasure. Was it truly lost to the tides, or was the story an exaggeration to cover for treasure already spent or plundered in the chaos? Whatever the truth, it was a fittingly calamitous end to a disastrous reign. Just days later, exhausted, sick with dysentery, and likely demoralized by his loss, King John dies in Newark Castle. He leaves behind a kingdom half occupied by a foreign invader, and a 9-year-old boy, Henry, as his heir. The future of the Plantagenet dynasty hangs by the thinnest of threads. The boy king, Henry III, who inherited a kingdom in flames, manages to survive. The loyal barons, led by the noble knight William Marshal, drive out the invading French and reaffirm Magna Carta, securing the throne for the young Plantagenet. Henry's long reign is one of relative peace, but also of simmering discontent. He is a pious man, more interested in art and architecture. You see his grand vision for the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey take shape than in the grim business of war. His court fills with his wife's foreign relatives who are given power and wealth, alienating the English barons, who eventually rise up in another rebellion. This time they are led by the charismatic Simon de Montfort, who for a time captures the king and his son, and in a radical move calls a parliament that includes not just barons, but common knights and townspeople. But the king's son is no weakling. You see in Prince Edward a different breed of Plantagenet. He is tall, so tall, he is nicknamed Longshanks, with a fierce intelligence and a fearsome temper. He is the kind of boss who doesn't need to raise his voice to be terrifying. His shadow is probably intimidating enough. He escapes captivity, rallies an army, and utterly crushes de Montfort's forces at the Battle of Evesham. When his father finally dies, Edward isn't even in the country. He is away on crusade, a clear sign of the stability he has already brought. When he returns, crowned King Edward, you know, the era of weak kings is over. Edward's gaze first turns to the west, to the mountains of Wales. The Welsh, under their proud prince Llewellyn ap Gruffudd, had taken advantage of the English civil wars to expand their power. Edward is not interested in treaties or oaths of fealty. He wants conquest total and final. You witness his campaigns, which are not just invasions, but masterclasses in methodical subjugation. He chokes the Welsh resistance with a strategy of overwhelming force and cutting-edge military engineering. He builds the great Iron Ring of castles, a chain of immense stone fortresses like Conwy Harlech and the magnificent Caernarfon. These are not just defensive structures. They are permanent, intimidating symbols of English power pushed deep into the Welsh heartland. The Welsh rebellion is crushed. Prince Llewellyn is ambushed and killed, and his head is sent to London to be displayed on a spike above the tower. Edward formalizes his conquest with the Statute of Wales, bringing the country under English law. And in a stroke of political genius, he names his own infant son, born at Caernarfon, the very first English Prince of Wales, a title the heir to the throne holds to this day. With Wales subdued, Edward turns his attention north to Scotland. Here a golden opportunity falls into his lap. The Scottish royal line dies out, and 13 different claimants step forward to stake their claim. To avoid a bloody civil war, the Scottish nobles make a catastrophic mistake. They invite the powerful and legally minded King of England to arbitrate the great cause and choose their next monarch. Asking Edward III to mediate your succession crisis was like asking a wolf to babysit your sheep. He agrees, but only after bullying the claimants into acknowledging him as Lord Paramount of Scotland. He picks the man with the strongest claim, John Balliol, but then proceeds to treat him as a puppet, deliberately humiliating him and interfering in Scottish affairs. When the Scots push too far, make an alliance with France, Edward explodes. He marches north with a huge army and earns his terrible epithet, Malleus Scotorum, the Hammer of the Scots. His assault on the port of Berwick-upon-Tweed is an infamous massacre. He shatters the main Scottish army, deposes King John, and in a final act of humiliation, he seizes the most sacred object in Scotland, the Stone of Scone. This quirky and symbolic tidbit of history resonates for centuries. The stone, a block of sandstone on which Scottish kings had been crowned for generations, is carried off to London. Edward has a special throne, King Edward's chair, built to house it, ensuring all future English monarchs would be crowned, sitting on the symbol of Scotland's subjugation. It was the ultimate psychological blow. I have not only conquered you, I've stolen your special chair. But Scotland is not Wales. The conquest that seemed so complete soon unravels. A fierce guerrilla resistance rises from the ashes, first led by a commoner of immense stature and charisma, William Wallace. After Wallace is eventually captured and subjected to a horrific traitor's execution. In London, the mantle of resistance is taken up by a nobleman, Robert the Bruce, the grandson of one of the original claimants, who has himself crowned King of Scots in defiance of Edward. The Scottish War becomes a bloody, expensive quagmire that consumes the final years of Edward's life. Yet for all his warlike reputation, Edward was also a great king of peace and law at home. He issues sweeping statutes, reforming land law and administration. And to fund his ceaseless wars, he needs the broad consent of the kingdom. Building on the precedents of the past, he makes Parliament a more regular and representative institution. His model Parliament of 1295 is famous because it was the first to include knights from the shires and burgesses from the towns, alongside the great lords and bishops, creating the template for the future House of Lords and House of Commons. His motive was practical. As he put it, that which touches all should be approved by all, especially when it came to paying taxes. Historians still argue whether Edward's development of Parliament was a cynical exercise in efficient taxation, or if he possessed a genuine belief in consulting with his subjects. In the end, the warrior king dies as he had lived. In 1307, old and sick, but still utterly determined, he is on his way north for yet another campaign against Robert the Bruce when his body finally fails him. His dying wish is for his bones to be carried at the head of his army, never to be buried, until Scotland was finally crushed. The great and terrible Hammer of the Scots dies in a gusty tent on the border of the kingdom he could never quite crush. His final command is that his bones be carried at the head of the army until Scotland is subdued. His son, the new king, Edward II, promptly ignores this. He gives his father a lavish funeral and abandons the Scottish campaign, hurrying south. You can immediately sense that this new king is not his father's son. He inherited his father's impressive height, but none of his ferocious drive or political cunning. It was like getting the cool packaging without the actual product inside. His first act as king is to recall his dearest friend from exile, a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston. For the powerful, grim-faced English barons who had fought alongside the old king, this elevation of a low-born foreigner is a deeply ominous sign. The entire reign of Edward II becomes dominated by his intense and politically catastrophic relationship with his male favorites. He makes Gaveston the Earl of Cornwall, a title usually reserved for royalty, and showers him with lands and treasure. Gaveston, for his part, is arrogant and sharp-witted, and he delights in giving the most powerful nobles of the realm insulting nicknames. Calling the formidable Earl of Warwick the Black Dog of Arden to his face is not a recommended strategy for career advancement or for staying alive. The baronage led by the king's immensely wealthy and powerful cousin Thomas of Lancaster sees Gaveston's influence as a threat to the kingdom itself. They band together and force Edward to agree to the Ordinances of 1311, a sweeping set of reforms that limits the king's power and, most importantly, demands the permanent exile of Piers Gaveston. Edward agrees, seething, and then, as soon as he feels strong enough, he invites Gaveston back. This time, the barons have had enough of talk. Civil war breaks out. Gaveston is cornered and captured. He surrenders on the promise that his life will be spared, but a group of the most hostile barons, including the Black Dog himself, seize him, and after a mockery of a trial, have him beheaded on a lonely hill. You can imagine Edward's reaction, not just grief, but a burning, impotent rage. The murder of his friend creates a wound that will never heal, and his desire for revenge against his cousin Lancaster will fester for years. While England is consumed by this internal strife, Robert the Bruce is methodically winning back Scotland castle by castle. By 1314, only Stirling Castle holds out, and the English garrison promises to surrender if an army doesn't relieve them by midsummer. Goaded into action, Edward the Saint gathers one of the largest English armies ever assembled and marches north. The result is the Battle of Bannockburn, the single most humiliating military defeat in English history. The Scottish army, smaller but brilliantly led, and fighting on terrain they know utterly demolishes the overconfident English host. You see English knights bogged down in the marshy ground, cut to pieces by disciplined Scottish spearmen. The English command structure collapses, and King Edward himself has to be dragged from the battlefield fleeing for his life. The victory secures Scottish independence and leaves Edward's martial reputation in tatters. For years, the kingdom limps along with the arrogant Thomas of Lancaster acting as the main power behind the throne. But Edward eventually finds new favorites to lean on Hugh Despencer, and his son also named Hugh. They are an English family, but just as greedy and power-hungry as Gaveston ever was, and they quickly become the focus of baronial hatred. Eventually, Edward gets his revenge. He isolates his cousin Lancaster, defeats him in battle, and has him executed as a traitor. For a brief period, Edward II and the Despensers rule as unchecked tyrants. But he has neglected one key person, his wife Queen Isabella. The daughter of the French king, she is a shrewd and proud woman who has been publicly humiliated by her husband's devotion to his favorites. In 1325, she is sent to her brother's court in France to negotiate a treaty. She will not return as a dutiful wife. In Paris, she enters into an open affair with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English lord who had escaped from the Tower of London after rebelling against the Despensers. They were the ultimate medieval power couple, bonded by a mutual hatred of the king. They gather a small army of mercenaries, and in the autumn of 1326, they land in England. The tyrannical regime universally despised simply dissolves. No one will fight for the king or the dispensers. Edward is captured while trying to flee to Wales. You are a witness in the great hall of Kenilworth Castle as a delegation of lords confronts the king. They read out the charges against him: incompetence, tyranny, losing Scotland. Broken and weeping, dressed in a simple black robe, Edward II agrees to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward III. The anointed king is then imprisoned in Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. What happened next is shrouded in dark rumor and propaganda. The official story was that he died of natural causes a few months later, but few believed it. Historians still argue about the true circumstances of Edward II's death. Evidence suggests he was murdered, though the lurid details that became popular later are almost certainly inventions. The most infamous and quirky story, a tale of grim poetic justice, alleged that he was killed by having a red-hot poker thrust up into his bowels through a horn, a method designed to leave no outward mark and serve as a ghastly punishment for his relationships. With the old king dead, Isabella and her lover Mortimer now rule England in the name of the boy king, having set a dangerous and bloody precedent. For 3 long years, England is ruled by the she-wolf Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. They are greedy and inept, and their shameful peace treaty with the victorious Scots is a source of national humiliation. But the boy king, in whose name they rule, is growing up fast. Young Edward III is his grandfather's grandson, possessed of a quiet, steely determination. In the autumn of 1330, when he is just 17, he decides the time has come. You are one of the small, trusted band of companions who joins him on a dark night at Nottingham Castle. While Mortimer and the Queen sleep, you are led through a secret underground tunnel that surfaces inside the castle walls. The coup is swift and bloodless. Mortimer is seized, much to the Queen's horror. It was the medieval version of a teenager finally kicking his mom's freeloading boyfriend out of the house and changing the locks. Mortimer is swiftly tried and executed as a traitor, and Queen Isabella is forced into a comfortable but permanent retirement. A new dynamic king now truly rules England. Edward III's ambition is to restore the glory that was lost under his father. His sights are set on France. The reasons for what will become the 100 Years' War are a complex tangle of feudal obligations, economic rivalries over the rich wool trade in Flanders, and French support for England's enemies in Scotland. The spark that lights the fire, however, is a dynastic one. The main line of French kings dies out. Through his mother, Isabella, Edward has a legitimate if distant claim to the French throne. The French nobility unsurprisingly choose a French cousin to be their new king, Philip VI. Historians still argue about the true nature of Edward III's claim to the French throne. Was it a genuine belief in his right, or a brilliant and audacious piece of political propaganda designed to legitimize his wars? Either way, in 1337, Edward formally claims the title King of France, and the Great War of the late Middle Ages begins. The war starts well for the English, with a major naval victory at Sluys that gives them control of the Channel. Then in 1346 comes the campaign that will define an era. You are a soldier in Edward's army as it marches through Normandy. You are tired, hungry, and far from home, and you know that a colossal French army many times your size is pursuing you. King Philip is desperate to trap and annihilate you. But Edward is a gifted commander. He finds a perfect defensive position on a sloping hillside near the village of Crecy, and there he halts and prepares for battle. He orders his knights and men-at-arms to dismount and take their place in the line, and on the flanks he positions his most valuable weapon, the thousands of archers armed with the English longbow. You watch as the French army arrives in the late afternoon. They are a magnificent but chaotic sight, a glittering sea of chivalry confident of victory. Without waiting to organize, the French knights begin a series of valiant but foolhardy charges up the slope directly into the English lines. And now, you hear at the sound of thousands of longbows loosing their arrows, at once a sound like a great and terrible hiss, a storm of steel-tipped shafts that darkens the sky. The arrows fall with devastating effect on the unarmored horses and find the gaps in the knights' plate armor. The French charged with all the tactical sophistication of a runaway train, and with roughly the same result. Again and again they charge, and again they are scythed down. The flower of French nobility perishes on that muddy slope. By nightfall, the French army is broken, and the English have won one of the most stunning and decisive victories in military history. The age of the mounted knight was shown to be over-eclipsed by the power of disciplined infantry and the longbow. Edward is now the most celebrated warrior king in Christendom. He besieges and captures the key port of Calais, which will remain an English stronghold for 200 years. Back home, he cultivates a court culture steeped in the ideals of chivalry tournaments and military glory. He decides to create a new order of knighthood, an elite body of companions to rival King Arthur's Round Table. The result is the most noble order of the Garter. Its founding has a quirky, famous story attached. During a great ball at court, a lady, some say, it was the Queen. Others, his mistress, the Countess of Salisbury, was dancing when her garter slipped and fell to the floor. As the surrounding courtiers began to snicker at her embarrassment, the king swooped in. He gallantly picked up the blue garter, strapped it to his own leg, and silenced the gossips by declaring in French, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame on him who thinks evil of it. He then proclaimed that this humble strap of fabric would become the symbol of the most revered order of chivalry in Europe. Edward had basically invented the concept of turning a potential PR disaster into an exclusive club. The victory at Crecy was a triumph, not just for the king, but for his 16-year-old son, Edward of Woodstock, who had commanded one of the divisions. The young prince fought with such courage that he began to build his own legendary reputation. He would become known to history as the Black Prince, and for a time, it seemed that he and his father were an invincible combination. The sun was shining on Plantagenet England, a golden age of chivalry, and victory had begun, and it felt as if it would last forever. But an enemy far more deadly than the French army was already gathering on the horizon, an enemy that no knight or longbowman could ever hope to defeat. The victory bells of Crecy and Calais have barely faded, and the chivalric court of Edward III glitters with confidence. But in the year 1348, you start to hear troubling stories from the continent. Rumors of a great pestilence, a sickness that empties entire cities, traveling inexorably westward from the far lands of the east. You hear of ghost ships drifting into Italian ports, their crews all dead. But it feels distant a problem for foreigners. The English summer is warm. The harvest looks promising, and God is surely still smiling on his victorious English. Then in August, a ship with a cargo of French wine docks at the port of Melcombe in Dorset. It carries more than just wine. It carries the most devastating invader in English history, an enemy that arrives not with banners and trumpets, but silently in the blood of the black rat and the gut of its flea. At first, you don't know what you're seeing. A friend complains of a headache, then a fever. The next day, you see it a hard, painful swelling in their groin or armpit, a bubo. It grows to the size of an apple, its color darkening to a bruised purple, then black. This is the Black Death. The fever worsens into delirium. The pain is unbearable, and within a week, often just a few days, the person is dead. Or worse, the sickness attacks the lungs, spreading through the air on a cough or a sneeze. And this pneumonic form kills even faster sometimes in a single day. There is no cure. There is no understanding. The physicians with their theories of bad air and imbalanced humors are useless. Their medical advice is so useless, you'd have been better off asking a fortune teller. You see people try desperate and quirky remedies, swallowing potions of crushed emeralds, smearing themselves with treacle, or applying poultices of pigeon dung. Some even try strapping a live plucked chicken to the buboes, hoping the bird will draw out the pestilence. Nothing works. The priests who bravely minister to the dying are among the first to fall. The churchyards fill up, then overflow. You see carts being wheeled through the streets at dawn, the driver calling out, "Bring out your dead." The bodies are tipped unceremoniously into great deep plague pits. The bonds of society begin to fray, then snap. Parents abandon their sick children. Children flee their dying parents. Fear acrid and absolute is the new ruler of England. The plague scours the land for 2 years. It moves along the roads, the rivers, the coastal trade routes. It leaves no part of the kingdom untouched. Whole villages are simply wiped from the map, their houses standing silent, their fields overgrown. No one can say for sure how many died. Historians still argue about the precise mortality rate of the Black Death in England, with estimates ranging from a catastrophic 30% to an almost unimaginable 50% or more. Imagine a world where every other person you know is gone. The psychological toll is immense. Some, believing it is God's punishment for the sins of mankind, join processions of flagellants whipping themselves bloody in public squares as an act of penance. Others, seeing no future, give themselves over to wild living, spending their last days in taverns and brothels. For you living through it, it feels like the end of the world. You wake up each morning, surprised to be alive, and you go to sleep wondering if you will see the dawn. By 1350, the first and worst wave of the pestilence recedes. It will return again for generations, but never with such devastating force. You emerge blinking into a new world. The landscape is the same, but the human geography has been redrawn forever. With so many people gone, the most basic law of economics has been turned on its head. There is a desperate shortage of labor. For the first time in your life, you, a humble peasant, have leverage. The lord of your manor needs his crops harvested, his fields plowed. He cannot force you to work for the old wages. You can simply walk away. Another lord down the road, whose own workforce has vanished, will gladly pay you more. Wages for farm workers and craftsmen double, even triple. For a generation, the survivors among the peasantry experience a startling new prosperity. You can afford better food, better clothing. The old feudal order, which bound a man to the land and the will of his lord, is shattered. The ruling classes are terrified by this shift in power. In 1351, the king's government passes the Statute of Laborers, a landmark piece of legislation that makes it illegal for employers to pay or for workers to receive wages higher than those of the pre-plague years. It was a desperate attempt by the government to hit the undo button on the laws of supply and demand, and it worked about as well then as it does now. The law is widely ignored and fiercely resented. It doesn't stop the economic changes, but it does breed a new and bitter class antagonism. The Black Death killed millions, but it also broke the chains of the old world. You can feel it in the air, a new sense of defiance among the common people, a growing anger at a government that seeks to deny them the fruits of their good fortune. The plague is over, but the troubles it has unleashed are just beginning. The golden age of Edward III ends not with a bang, but a whimper. The great warrior, the Black Prince, dies of sickness before his father. The old king himself, the victor of Crecy, declines into senility, supposedly doting on a greedy mistress. When he finally dies in 1377, the crown passes to his grandson, Richard II, a boy of just 10 years old. The realm is run by a council dominated by his powerful and unpopular uncle John of Gaunt. The glorious victories in France have faded, and the war is now just a costly, grinding drain on the treasury. To pay for it, the government introduces a new, deeply unfair poll tax, charging every person the same amount, whether they are a rich merchant or a poor farmer. It was the most aggressive customer complaint in tax history, and it ignites a firestorm. In the summer of 1381, you witness the eruption of the peasants' revolt. Tens of thousands of commoners from the southeast of England, inflamed by the tax and years of simmering resentment from the post-plague labor laws, rise up. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and a radical priest named John Ball, who preaches that all people should be equal, they march on London. They burn the houses of government officials, storm the Tower of London, and murder the Archbishop of Canterbury. The government is paralyzed with fear. Then comes an extraordinary moment. The king, now just 14 years old, rides out to meet the vast rebel army at Smithfield. During a tense negotiation, the hot-headed Wat Tyler is struck down and killed by the mayor of London. For a heart-stopping moment, the thousands of rebels raise their bows ready to slaughter the king and his small party. But Richard, showing a courage that astounds everyone, spurs his horse forward alone, shouting, "Sirs, will you shoot your king? I am your captain, follow me." His bravery works. The mob, stunned, lowers their weapons and follows him out of the city. He promises them charters of freedom and pardons. The revolt melts away. It is a moment of pure theater and genius. The promises, of course, are swiftly broken, and the leaders are brutally suppressed. But a legend has been born around the boy king. As Richard matures, you see him develop a vision of kingship that is very different from his grandfather's. While Edward's court was all about jousting and battle plans, Richard's is a haven of culture, refinement, and art. He is a great patron of the poet Chaucer and the artist of the beautiful Wilton diptych. He pours money into rebuilding Westminster Hall, giving it the magnificent hammer-beam roof you can still see today. He creates a court that is lavish, sophisticated, and centered on the quasi-divine majesty of the king himself, whose personal symbol is the serene white hart. Historians still argue about Richard's motivations. Was he a vindictive despot or a principled monarch trying to establish a modern style of kingship free from the overbearing power of nobles? This new style does not sit well with his powerful warlike uncles and cousins. They see his peace policies with France as shameful and his reliance on a small circle of low-born favorites as an insult. The tension culminates in a group of powerful nobles, the Lords Appellant, rising up and seizing control of the government. They humiliate the king, forcing him to witness the trial and execution of his closest friends. Richard never forgives them. He spends the next 8 years quietly rebuilding his power, nursing his grudge. Then, in 1397, he strikes. In a sudden ruthless political coup, he arrests the leading lord's appellant who had wronged him a decade earlier. One is executed, another exiled for life, and the most powerful, his own uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, is taken to Calais and secretly murdered. Richard is finally supreme. For 2 years, he rules as a tyrant. You feel the atmosphere of fear. He governs without Parliament, forces his former enemies to pay enormous fines to buy back their lives, and roams the country with a personal army of archers from Cheshire who intimidate the populace. His power seems absolute. Then he makes his final fatal error. In 1399, his uncle John of Gaunt dies. Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, is already in exile, one of the men Richard had banished. With Henry powerless overseas, Richard does the unthinkable. He confiscates the entire vast Lancastrian inheritance, the wealthiest estate in England, effectively disinheriting his cousin. Stealing your powerful exiled cousin's inheritance is generally filed under spectacularly bad ideas in the Royal Handbook. It was an attack on the very principle of property and inheritance that underpinned the whole aristocratic world. While Richard is distracted by a campaign in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke lands on the English coast, claiming he has only come to reclaim his rightful dukedom. Disaffected nobles, fearing their own lands, could be next flocked to his side. The kingdom abandons Richard. When he returns from Ireland, his support has evaporated. He is taken prisoner, and in a formal public assembly, he is deposed for his tyranny. This is a seismic event, a divinely anointed king brought down by his own people. The crown is given to Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes King Henry IV. Richard is taken north and imprisoned in the grim fortress of Pontefract Castle. A few months later, he is dead. To quash persistent rumors that he was still alive, his body was brought to London and put on public display in St. Paul's Cathedral, his face exposed for all to see. The official cause of death was self-starvation, but few doubted he had been murdered, a final dark necessity to secure the throne for the new Lancastrian dynasty. The sun had set on the last direct Plantagenet king. The crown now rests on the head of Henry Bolingbroke, who styles himself King Henry IV. But it is a hollow, heavy thing. He is a usurper, a man who took the throne by force and holds it only with the goodwill of the powerful nobles who helped him. You feel the insecurity of his reign from the very first day. He is haunted by the ghost of the king he deposed and likely murdered, a fact that his enemies never let him forget. His entire reign is a frantic game of whack-a-mole, with rebellions and conspiracies popping up all over his kingdom. The famous line from a play written long after his death perfectly captures his reality. Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. Almost immediately, the realm begins to fracture. In Wales, a charismatic landowner named Owain Glyndwr declares himself Prince of Wales and launches a brilliant and long-lasting war for independence. For over a decade, Glyndwr's guerrilla campaigns are a running sore on the side of Henry's kingdom, draining his treasury and defying his authority. Then, an even more dangerous threat emerges from his own supporters. The Percy family of Northumberland, the kingmakers, who were crucial to Henry's success, feel they have been poorly rewarded. Led by the fiery and impulsive Henry Percy, nicknamed Hotspur, they make an alliance with the Scots and with the Welsh rebel Glinger and rise against the king. Deciding to ally with your former enemies against the king you just helped crown is a bold career move, even for a guy named Hotspur. The armies meet in 1403 at the bloody Battle of Shrewsbury. It is a desperate close-run fight. You see the king's own son, the 16-year-old Prince Henry, known as Hal, struck in the face with an arrow. In a quirky and famous piece of medical history, the arrowhead embeds itself 6 inches deep into his cheek, next to his nose. A lesser man would have retreated or died, but the prince keeps fighting. After the battle, a brilliant royal surgeon named John Bradmore invents a special threaded tool to carefully extract the arrowhead, saving the future king's life, but leaving him with a deep facial scar. Hotspur is killed in the battle, and the Percy rebellion is crushed. But the victory brings little peace to the troubled king. Historians still argue about the extent of the rift between the aging sick Henry IV and his son Prince Hal. Shakespeare paints a dramatic picture of a wild tavern-haunting youth who magically transforms into a great king. The reality is that the young prince was already a hardened soldier and an experienced politician, often at odds with his cautious father's policies. When Henry IV finally dies in 1413, worn out by his struggles and a debilitating skin disease, the crown passes to a man who is ready for it. At 26, Henry V is everything his father was not. In his final years, young, dynamic, supremely confident, and fiercely ambitious. He is determined to unite the fractious country, and he knows just how to do it by restarting the glorious war against a divided and vulnerable France. In 1415, Henry V invades Normandy with a small but professional army. The campaign begins with the difficult and costly siege of Harfleur. The town falls, but dysentery rips through the English camp, leaving his army weak and desperately depleted. His plan to march overland to the safety of English-held Calais is a huge gamble. As expected, a colossal French army outnumbering the English by at least 5-1 intercepts them. You are one of those English soldiers, sick, exhausted, and trapped. You stand in a muddy field between 2 woods near a castle called Agincourt. On paper, it looks less like a battle and more like a foregone conclusion. On the morning of October 25th, St. Crispin's Day, the French attack. It is Crécy all over again, but even more spectacular. The French knights, weighed down by their heavy armor, have to charge across a narrow, rain-soaked plowed field that quickly turns into a quagmire. Funneled into a tight space, they become a perfect target for the thousands of English and Welsh longbowmen hammering their flanks with a relentless storm of arrows. The French vanguard is slaughtered. Successive waves of men-at-arms pile in behind them, creating a horrific crush where men are trampled, suffocated, and stabbed with brutal efficiency by the lightly equipped English. The victory is not just total, it is miraculous. It is seen as undeniable proof that God is on the side of the English and their warrior king. Agincourt makes Henry V a legend. He follows it up with a slow, methodical conquest of Normandy. The French, paralyzed by the madness of their king and the civil war between their nobles, are unable to stop him. The incredible climax comes with the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. You witness a diplomatic triumph that seems to achieve the ultimate goal of the 100 Years' War. The French king Charles VI agrees that upon his death, the crown of France will not pass to his own son, the Dauphin, but to Henry V and his future heirs. To seal the deal, Henry marries Charles's daughter, Catherine of Valois. In a few short years, Henry V has gone from being the king of a troubled island to the undisputed heir of two kingdoms. The future of this new dual monarchy of England and France seems destined for glory under the brilliant Lancastrian king. The joy of Agincourt and the triumph of the Treaty of Troy are shockingly brief. In 1422, at the very peak of his power, the mighty warrior king Henry V dies suddenly of dysentery while on campaign in France. He is only 35. He never lives to inherit the French crown, leaving his dual monarchy to the most fragile of heirs, his only son Henry, an infant of just 9 months. It was the medieval equivalent of a baby inheriting two rival multinational corporations, and you can feel the immediate anxiety that ripples through the kingdom. The government is placed in the hands of a council of the baby's powerful uncles, who must now try to hold together his father's vast and fragile conquests. The joy of Agincourt and the triumph of the Treaty of Troy are shockingly brief. In 1422, at the very peak of his power, the mighty warrior king Henry V dies suddenly of dysentery while on campaign in France. He is only 35. He never lives to inherit the French crown, leaving his dual monarchy to the most fragile of heirs, his only son Henry, an infant of just 9 months. It was the medieval equivalent of a baby inheriting two rival multinational corporations, and you can feel the immediate anxiety that ripples through the kingdom. The government is placed in the hands of a council of the baby's powerful uncles, who must now try to hold together his father's vast and fragile conquests. For a time it works. The English armies in France, led by the capable Duke of Bedford, continue to win victories. But then from the heart of defeated France, a new and astonishing force emerges. You start to hear tales of a young peasant girl, barely a teenager, called Joan, who claims to be guided by the voices of saints. She convinces the desperate French Dauphin to give her command of his army. In 1429, she inspires the French soldiers to lift the English siege of Orléans, a stunning and improbable victory that completely reverses the momentum of the war. Though Joan is soon captured and controversially burned at the stake by the English and their allies as a heretic, the fire she lit cannot be extinguished. The French spirit is reborn. Over the next 2 decades, you watch with a sense of helpless dismay as the English are relentlessly pushed back. The French, now using powerful new cannons, smash the walls of castles that had held for centuries. Normandy is lost. Then Gascony, the last remnant of the old Angevin Empire that England had held for 300 years, also falls. By 1453, the 100 Years' War is effectively over. All of Henry V's glorious gains have turned to dust. Only the port of Calais remains in English hands. As the empire collapses abroad, the kingdom decays at home. Henry II grows from a cradle king into a man utterly unsuited for the throne. He was a lovely man who would have made an excellent monk, but as a medieval king, he was hopelessly underqualified, like bringing a prayer book to a sword fight. He is gentle, generous to a fault, and profoundly spiritual, but he has no interest in government or warfare. His court is dominated by factions of grasping nobles who exploit his weakness to enrich themselves and mismanage the kingdom. His wife, the French princess, Margaret of Anjou, becomes the real power of the Lancastrian regime. Proud, ruthless, and fiercely protective of her gentle husband and the rights of her son. The humiliating loss of France creates a crisis. There is widespread anger, and the blame falls squarely on the king's corrupt and incompetent advisors. A powerful champion emerges to voice this national discontent, Richard the Duke of York. York is the wealthiest nobleman in the land, a respected soldier, and most dangerously of all, he has a very strong claim to the throne himself. Some would argue a better claim than King Henry's. Historians still argue about the true nature of Richard of York's ambitions at this stage. Was he a loyal reformer, or was he cynically using the language of good governance to mask a desire for the crown itself? Whatever his motive, you see the battle lines being drawn between the party of the king, the House of Lancaster, and the party of his powerful challenger, the House of York. The breaking point arrives in 1453. As news of the final loss of Gascony reaches England, the king's mind, already fragile, snaps. He sinks into a complete catatonic stupor, sitting silently for over a year, unable to speak, move, or react to anything. In a particularly quirky and disturbing tidbit, the court records show he gave no sign of recognition at all when they presented him with his own newborn son and heir. With the king effectively a living statue, Parliament has no choice but to appoint Richard of York as Lord Protector of England. York governs well, but his authority is temporary. On Christmas Day, 1454, the king suddenly wakes up as if from a long dream. Queen Margaret, who despises York, wastes no time. She has him stripped of his power and freezes him out of government completely. The street fight at St. Albans opens the floodgates to a generation of dynastic chaos. The political loyalty of a 15th century nobleman is about as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane. For the next few years, the wheel of fortune spins wildly. Richard of York is defeated and killed at the Battle of Wakefield, his severed head mockingly adorned with a paper crown and displayed on the walls of York. But his cause is immediately taken up by his eldest son, Edward, a young man who is handsome, charming, and a military genius. In the midst of a blinding snowstorm on Palm Sunday, 1461, you witness his Yorkist army clash with the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton. It is the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, a brutal hacking melee that lasts for hours and leaves tens of thousands dead. By the end of the day, the Lancastrian army is annihilated, and the young Edward Earl of March is the undisputed master of England. He is crowned King Edward IV, and the House of York now sits on the throne. Edward IV is a capable and charismatic king, but he makes a critical error. While his most powerful supporter, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, is negotiating a prestigious marriage alliance with France, Edward secretly marries a beautiful English widow of Lancastrian connections, Elizabeth Woodville. Marrying for love is a romantic notion, but it's a political disaster. The new queen's large and ambitious family, the Woodvilles, soon monopolize royal favor, infuriating Warwick and the old Yorkist nobility. The Kingmaker, feeling his influence wane, does the unthinkable. He switches sides, makes an alliance with his old enemy, Margaret of Anjou, and invades England. Edward IV is caught by surprise and forced to flee, while the bewildered and frail Henry VI is fetched from the Tower of London and placed back on the throne. But the Yorkist king is not finished. In 1471, Edward lands with a small army and demonstrates his military brilliance. In a whirlwind campaign, he outmaneuvers and defeats Warwick, who is killed in battle. He then intercepts Margaret of Anjou's army, killing her son, the last Lancastrian heir. A few days later, King Henry VI dies in the Tower of London, almost certainly murdered to extinguish the Lancastrian cause for good. Edward IV now rules, unopposed, for 12 years. You feel a sense of peace and prosperity return to the weary kingdom. It seems the wars are finally over. Then in 1483, the 40-year-old king, still in his prime, dies suddenly after a short illness. The crown passes to his 12-year-old son, Edward V. The boy's uncle, the late king's loyal and trusted younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is named Lord Protector. Richard has a reputation as a pious, just, and brilliant administrator and soldier. He moves decisively, intercepting the young king and his Woodville relatives on their way to London. He places young Edward and later his younger brother in the royal apartments at the Tower of London, ostensibly for their protection before the coronation. But the coronation never happens. Suddenly, a priest preaches a sermon declaring that Edward IV's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, making their children illegitimate. With the Woodville heirs disqualified, Parliament declares Richard the rightful king. After a show of reluctance, he accepts the crown, becoming King Richard III. His journey from loyal brother to king was one of the most ruthless and efficient hostile takeovers in history. And then the two boys in the Tower of London simply disappear. Their fate becomes the most enduring and controversial mystery in all of English history. Historians still argue fiercely whether they were murdered on the orders of their uncle Richard III, or if they perhaps survived with blame falling on other figures. A quirky but poignant discovery was made nearly 2 centuries later in 1674, when workmen found a chest buried beneath a staircase in the tower, containing the skeletons of 2 children widely believed to be the lost princes. Richard's reign is short and beset by rebellion from those horrified by his seizure of the throne. A new final challenger emerges from across the sea. Henry Tudor, a nobleman with a threadbare claim to the throne through a remote and illegitimate branch of the House of Lancaster. Backed by French money, he lands in Wales in 1485. Richard III meets him with a larger army at Bosworth Field. But in the heat of the battle, Richard is betrayed. One of his most powerful nobles refuses to commit his troops, while another switches sides entirely. Seeing Henry Tudor's banner across the field, Richard makes a last desperate gamble. He leads his personal household cavalry in a frantic do-or-die charge straight at his rival. For a moment, it looks like he might succeed, but he is surrounded, pulled from his horse, and hacked to death. On the battlefield, the bloody crown is picked from a bush and placed on the head of Henry Tudor, who becomes King Henry VII. The Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled England for over 300 years, is over. The medieval age dies with Richard on that bloody field. And so the long and turbulent story of England's medieval dynasties comes to a close. The great wheel of fortune, which had lifted and crushed so many kings, has spun one last time, bringing forth a new name, a new era. The echoes of their world, the clash of swords, the whispered prayers in cold stone chapels, the rustle of royal silk, and the cries of the common folk all begin to soften, now fading into the quiet of the night. The grand ambitions of the conqueror, the fury of Henry II, the chivalry of Edward III, and the tragic mystery of the last Plantagenet king all recede, becoming figures in a tapestry that is now complete. The struggles that seemed so all-consuming to them are now just stories for us, whispers from a distant time, a reminder of how fragile power can be and how relentlessly the future arrives. Let the noise of battle and the weight of their crowns dissolve into the gentle hum of your room. Let the darkness be a comforting blanket, a peaceful end to a long and tumultuous journey. There are no more rebellions to crush, no more thrones to win or lose. There is only the stillness of the present moment, the rise and fall of your own gentle breath. leading you now toward the peaceful realm of your own dreams. The story is over. It is time to rest. Sweet dreams.